Yeah, welcome to this Every Cloud virtual roundtable, which we're running today in partnership with Netscope. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rob Mukherjee, Director of Transformation at Every Cloud, and I'm delighted to be sharing the hosting duties today with Ross Asquith from Netscope. And Ross will actually lead most of the discussion today as we explore the topic of DLP, data loss prevention, and give you an insight into Netscope's latest solution to address challenges around email DLP in particular. And we'd love for this session to be interactive and relaxed. You've hopefully managed to grab a drink. I'm actually on water today as I've got to drop my son off for football training at 6 o'clock. So no beers or anything for me today. But please do get involved. Thank you for putting yourselves on cameras. It's great to see so many faces because we don't see as many as we would like at the moment as we gradually ease out of lockdown. Please do use the Zoom chat facility, or if you want to speak, raise your hand, and we will always come to you for any comments or questions. We may, as we're going through, depending on how we're doing. Hi, David. Good to see you. And well, you've got David testing the comments for us. Thank you. We may throw a couple of polls in as well, just to make things interesting. And I know that many of you, like David, in fact, have been to our events before. And of course, we're also honoured to have several of you as customers. But for those of you who are less familiar with Every Cloud, we're a cloud security and a cloud communications business, actually. And our purpose in life is to help people work anywhere securely. And we do that by applying two themes, really, protect and connect. So we protect businesses through best-of-breed cloud security and cloud backup solutions, advanced email security, identity and access management solutions, etc. And we look to connect businesses with customers, with colleagues, etc., through cloud communications and cloud contact center solutions, and things like Microsoft Teams, voice telephony integrations, for example. And importantly, in everything we do, we talk about helping our clients build a people-led future fueled by technology, not vice versa, not a technology-led future. It has to be people-led. And we always remember that technology is just the fuel that acts as an enabler for people and businesses to do great things. And finally, the other aspect we try to work really hard on is to help businesses get more for less. You know, are there opportunities for rationalization, consolidation, to help you get the most and to help you get optimum value from your IT spend? You know, it's absolutely not about just selling the next security tool here at Every Cloud. And what we are about is working with technology partners who share that ethos and who enable us to deliver on those principles for our customers. And on that note, I would now like to hand over to one such technology partner that we are privileged to partner with, and that is, of course, Netscope and Ross. And just a reminder, please do pop any questions and comments in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to. Ross, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Yes, thanks very much for inviting me to talk today. I know we build the event as a roundtable, so we will try and encourage some interaction, but I am going to present at you to a certain degree. But those polls are going to come up and hopefully they'll spark some discussions too, and we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end, I guess. So I'm going to share my screen without any further ado, if I can find the right button. Bear with me a second. And we want this one. So hopefully someone can give me a thumbs up, but hopefully you're seeing my sort of intro slide. Thank you very much. Yeah, so Netscope have introduced new capabilities around DLP for email, and we're going to talk about those at the end, but I'm going to talk more generally about data protection as well across the portfolio that we offer. I'm part of the sales engineering team here at Netscope. I won't go too technical, don't worry. But hopefully there'll be enough information here to make this valuable. But do ask the questions that you want to. There's no silly questions. We'll answer them all. So I guess for those of you that aren't familiar with Netscope, I'll just give a brief introduction as to kind of what we do in the simplest terms I can. And if we frame, you know, our looking at Netscope in terms of the remote working, which is, you know, like so many of us still are working from home, for example. If we think about people and where they need to go to get their job done, I often boil it down to this simple diagram. We need to go to websites, We need to go to cloud applications, and we need to go to private applications that our organization gives to us. And they might be in the traditional data center location, on premises, as it were, or they may have moved some of those applications into the public cloud, things like AWS or Azure, for example. So as a security solution, Netscope wants to basically be in between everybody and these destinations, and as such, without anywhere else for users to really go, if we can govern and give visibility here, then we're in a great place for helping businesses with managing their IT security concerns. And specifically, I guess data protection is key in here, as is threat protection, and we'll touch upon both. But this architecture in itself is a real transformation. When Rob talks about, operate anywhere security, that's absolutely what Netscope are, because we're all about giving you all the controls and governance that you need from, regardless of where your users are. Increasingly topical, obviously, over the past 12, 18 months. So how do we do this? Well, when it comes to connecting to those internal applications, traditionally people have done that with VPNs and things. VPNs are beginning to be seen as perhaps not the most efficient way to connect people to those internal applications. They become a bit cumbersome when you move your applications into the public cloud, and they can be, in some cases, not as secure as you'd think, because they allow quite often lateral movement within the environment that you're connected to, and that can so often be a feature of exploitation, by a malicious user or malicious insider, compromised credentials, things like that. So zero trust network access is the first kind of part of the solution set that Netscope have that I just wanted to introduce, providing with access into these private environments. The other is our next generation secure web gateway, which is all about understanding what cloud applications are being used, how the internet's being used, what websites are being visited, and really using that information again to govern that usage with a view to lowering risk, protecting data, protecting from threats, and so on. We're going to drill down into some more functionality there in a bit, so I won't go any further. But what I will say is when you start consolidating these types of solutions together, these kinds of cloud delivered security tools, network security tools, what you're building is what Gartner have called the SASE architecture, a secure access service edge, which again, I could present for an hour on, but I'll just drop it in here. And if you want to learn more about SASE, have a chat with EveryCloud or with us, and we'll tell you more about what SASE is and why, as an architectural model, so many organizations are moving towards it, and how it can obviously offer benefits to the way you're doing security. So I'm going to think for a moment about this secure web gateway. It does a great job of managing access to cloud applications and websites, but there was another channel that became apparent that we didn't have visibility of when we were trying to look at where data was going. And if we want to protect data, we need to be able to see it. So Netscope can see data when it moves to cloud applications, and it can see data when it moves to websites. But there was this route out the organization that stemmed from typically the Office 365 environment, or perhaps the Google Workspace environment, which of course was email. And this didn't come anywhere near Netscope's security cloud. And our customers came to us and said, look, it's great. We can build these data protection policies to recognize perhaps sensitive data moving out to the internet, to cloud apps, to websites. But email, we need something there. And so what we very recently introduced, and what I'm going to talk about a bit later on, is our ability now to turn that email inward, as it were, to the Netscope security cloud, so that we can inspect it before it then flies off to wherever its destination is. And obviously, by passing that email through our security cloud, we can once again apply the controls that perhaps we've been applying to other data movement to cloud apps, for example, to email as well. So I'm going to drill down into a little bit more detail on it, but that's basically was our objective, and it was totally customer driven. We never set out to be looking at email really, but here we are. We were able to deliver a solution, and it's all about the data protection story. So before I go into the email piece, I did want to talk a little bit more about the next generation secure web gateway, because when we think about data protection, it's becoming increasingly common that people are concerned about the data moving into the cloud apps, right? So you may have a young and attractive IT team like this stock photo, and they will be responsible in your organization for managing the applications that IT offer to the business, right? And we're all very familiar with things like Office 365 or Salesforce or Box or whatever our apps are that we manage. But you'll also be aware that within most organizations, there are many other applications that are being used. Sometimes these get labeled as shadow IT, right? Users have found them themselves, or departments have spun up cloud applications, and generally they make up the majority of the apps that are used within a business. Something like, well over 95% of the apps in many businesses will be so-called shadow IT, and IT departments don't actually manage them directly. So at this point, I'm going to throw in our first poll, which I'm going to ask Liz to push up on screen, because I thought it would be interesting to see if you can tell us within your organizations, how many cloud applications do you think are actually being used? I gave you some percentages in terms of how the managed versus unmanaged broke down, but where would you say your number of applications in use in total sits? And we'll give you a few seconds to have a think about that. In fact, I think I might have to answer it myself just to move it off the screen. I'll just close it. There we go. So Liz, when you feel we've got the majority of respondents come in, then you could push those results and we'll have a little look. And I'll offer you perhaps a bit of insight. Okay. So 50-50 then, around fewer than 100 and more than 100. So within larger enterprises, by which I mean kind of typically over 1,000 or 1,500 users, generally we see well over 1,200, sometimes pushing towards 2,000 cloud apps being used, which is a big number, right? Almost as many apps as people within those organizations. Typically, I think people underestimate the number of cloud apps being used, unless you're in a very tightly controlled environment. So I think that, more than 100 just about pipped it with the 50% there. And some people, obviously, perhaps in larger organizations, more than 500. So it's kind of in line with what I'd expect to see, I think. It's good that no one was saying none. I mean, that's pretty backward. I'm not sure what value you're going to get out of this call if you're not using any cloud apps. And I'm not sure many businesses would be able to survive today if they didn't use any cloud apps, right? So I don't know if anyone...
I can see Russell has said in the chat, many more than we realise, which I guess is your whole point about shadow IT, Ross, that you don't know half the applications that are being used. Well, a lot more than half often. That's
true, yeah. And I could have put my cliched, iceberg slide up next to say, tip of the iceberg is the stuff you know about, and then there's all this other stuff. And the line between websites and cloud apps has blurred over time too, right? What used to be a very static engagement with a website is now actually going to be something perhaps you can interact with. You see the BBC website here as one of my apps. I mean, do you think about the BBC website as an app? But you can interact with it in that way, right? You can post things there, and there's forums and stuff where you can contribute, and you can download content. It is like an app. You log into it, who knows your identity and so on. So sometimes the line is blurred. Okay, so that was interesting, but let's keep talking about these shadow IT apps, because typically that's where we think about risk being. So if I pick an app from within my little matrix here that I don't really recognize, I have no idea what that logo is or what that app is, and therefore I immediately think there's a risk associated with it. And that might be the case. I literally don't know what that is, but it is also the case that there is risk within, or can be risk within, the applications that IT has given to you to use, especially if we think of them as just being, in this case, Office 365. Is that a risky app or not? Well, if my business uses Office 365, I might think that's a perfectly safe environment, but all it takes is for me to log into a different Office 365 environment, and suddenly I've got a whole load of risk back on my hands again, because now I've got to worry about my data going into this other Office 365 environment. I also have to worry about, environments within Office 365 that are being used by cyber criminals to host malware and deliver it into my organization. That's becoming increasingly common. Using OneDrive to deliver malware is one of the top vectors now for getting it into organizations, because it's so often, I mean, who blocks access to Office 365 if you use it yourself? So risk creeps in not only in these so-called shadow IT, but also within perhaps the applications we're managing. And ultimately, the difference between these two things is the user and their activities, right? So maybe this is where the risk should rightly be attributed. It may not always be intentional behavior, it might just be a mistake. But if we can do something to manage the activity of the user when they're engaging with these cloud applications and websites, we can do something to control our risk, which is obviously always our goal. So if you find yourself using cloud storage applications, you'll be familiar with some of these buttons and links and logos. There are many ways that you can engage with cloud applications. And it's this subtle difference between, using the functionality of a cloud app to get some business done and using the functionality of a cloud app to cause a compliance incident, right? And they look very similar. They are very similar. They're very similar behaviors and actions. But the outcome is obviously very different, and one is desirable and one is not. One is definitely not. You don't want your compliance incident or your security incident or your regulatory incident, to be attributed to a user within your environment. So what can we do? So let's talk about what Netscope could do then on a very simple kind of a use case. So I've picked on Hayley in marketing. She's fictitious. Any similarity to any Hayley in your marketing department is purely coincidental. But she needs to share a file with a third-party agency, somebody external. So Hayley has in this case, an Excel file, and she wants to share it. And she knows that there are tools she can use to do that. So the first tool perhaps she thinks of using is WeTransfer. She's heard of it. She's used it before, maybe. And so this seems like the ideal tool for sharing an application with somebody external to a company. So at this point, when you're running through Netscope's next generation secure gateway, we could actually send a message to the user, pop up a message to the user, to Hayley, and say, look, you need to use a less risky app. Netscope knows that WeTransfer was compromised, a year and a bit ago, had a pretty severe breach where data was sent to the wrong people. We know that it doesn't meet our requirements in terms of its security and standards that it provides. So we're going to coach Hayley to use a less risky app. And so Hayley says, fair enough, that's okay, thanks for the guidance. I know a good other app, I'll use Dropbox. Because I've seen other people using Dropbox. I know I can get to Dropbox within the organization, it's allowed. So Hayley goes to Dropbox and attempts to upload her file to Dropbox. Now, at this point, Netscope can say, well, hang on a second, Dropbox isn't the kind of company sanctioned cloud storage or sharing application. So we'll give Hayley another message. And this time we'll say, look, you can use Dropbox. You have seen other people using it. You can use it to download things when people share them with you. But you're trying to upload something into Dropbox, and we don't allow that because it's not our corporate account or our corporate cloud storage instance. So we want you to try Microsoft OneDrive, and maybe we'd even redirect Hayley at this point to OneDrive instead. So now we've redirected Hayley to the correct app, and Hayley goes ahead and logs into Office 365, but hang on a second, she used her personal credentials to sign into OneDrive, and she's accessing a personal OneDrive instance. That's not going to be good either, because that's just as bad as going to an application that we don't control. If we put this data in that environment, we've lost it. So in this case, Netscope recognizes this email address is wrong, or the tenant that's being logged into is wrong, and we steer Hayley towards using her work email address that she now uses. So this means that Hayley can upload the file to OneDrive. That completes successfully, but her next action is then to try and share it with somebody. And hang on a second, when we look at that file that's just been uploaded, we can say, hang on, it looks like you've got some PII data in there, some sensitive data. Do we want that being shared? Do we want that, within OneDrive and available to the outside world? Probably not. So again, we'll prevent that action of sharing, and we'll coach Hayley towards examining that data and perhaps removing the offending information. Now, obviously, if Hayley does need to share PII data, that's a whole different cup of tea. She's going to need to get some approval to do that. But she could probably remove that data and share what she needs to. And what we've ended up with is obviously this guided path for Hayley to get to where she needed to be. And what's great is that tomorrow, when Hayley needs to share that file or a different file, she's going to know the process. There won't be all these dead ends, straight lines. So we've optimized the business process in a way and reduced the operational risk associated with doing the wrong thing all the time and the inefficiency of it. So at this point, we're going to do poll number 2, because I'm curious to hear what people's views are on this next question, and it's about sharing data. So poll 2 coming right up. That's poll 1. There we go. So where do you think the majority of data loss might be happening within your business? So if I asked you, and you might say, oh, we don't have any data loss, but if we're honest, well, maybe think about where would you suspect if it did happen, it would happen. Is it these SaaS applications being used, people uploading data into them? Is it still email, the most common way of perhaps sharing information still today? Is it USB drives being plugged in? Or if you're unsure or you don't know, then there's an option for that too. So let's see what comes in. Obviously, I've talked a lot about these SaaS applications and how they can be used to, or how data can escape to the wider world through them. But that might not be your primary concern.
Ross, just while we're waiting for, I see the results will put out. You may also see there's another question from Russell.
Okay.
In the chat around whether you can, thanks Russell, you can see that, can you track this before it actually happens? Russell, feel free to come off mute if you like, if you want to elaborate, by the way. Or you're still on mute?
So I would say in terms of, if you're asking whether this is happening in real time, the answer is yes. So, our solution that would create this path for Hayley here is being done in real time. As she tries to upload something, it would stop her uploading it, and then we would advise her that there was some PII data in there. So she'd have to retry to upload her file. If she tries to visit WeTransfer, she won't get there. We'll block it, but we'll put the message up to redirect. So everything here is preventing the wrong steps and leaves Hayley with no choice but to take the right ones, okay? Which is a softly kind of education process, I guess. And
is that both in terms of a file and also potentially content that's just embedded within the email? So the ways to circumvent it are quite limited?
Yeah, so we would look at any data posted into the cloud application, whether it was in a file uploaded or whether it was written in a Slack chat or whatever. We see it as an outbound data send, basically, I guess. We're going to come on to talking about how it applies to email, but the principle there is the same. If an email has been sent and it comes through us, then we would inspect the body, the attachments, and if we found it, well, we'll talk about what we do when we find it. But yes, everything's being done in real time here. Okay.
And then from Mark, the classic old-fashioned security question, I guess, where we've all had a situation where people think that security is sometimes stopping people from being productive, stopping them from doing the job. So Mark's question is, how do you cope with Hayley's directors screaming at you that you're stopping their department from doing their job?
Yeah, that's it. That's kind of exactly what we're trying to avoid, right? By not just blocking, because there's too many times. We'll take that Dropbox example, right? I said that although Hayley couldn't upload to Dropbox, she could download stuff from Dropbox. How many organizations would just be simply blocking access to Dropbox? Because that's how the lack of granularity with traditional controls works, right? Nobody has access to Dropbox. Then Hayley would start, or Hayley's director might start screaming because she's saying my team can't do my job, can't do their jobs because someone's trying to share something with them, they can't get to Dropbox. So then IT put the exception in place, right? So then there's the exception for Dropbox.com, but that doesn't just allow people to download. Now you've opened up a window for uploading to Dropbox. So we're going to talk about that kind of granularity actually in a couple of slides' time. So I'll save my further ranting.
It's all about the safely. What we found with one thing our Netscope clients really like is that safe. It's not about blocking; it's about safely enabling. So,
exactly.
You can allow some content, but you may not allow credit card information to go up to Dropbox, or you may not allow passport information, for argument's sake. And or if there's an unsafe application that people are trying to use to share. So let's say you're happy for them to use Dropbox, but you're not happy for them to use something that's less resilient or less secure, like Zippy Share, for example. It can then coach Hayley and say, oh, I see you're trying to share a file, but actually rather than use Zippy file or Zippy Share, the approved application for our business is Dropbox. So it'll coach and direct and try and help people do what they need to do as opposed to just a blunt block.
Exactly. And there's another question coming there about Office 365 specifically. Yeah, because I kind of use OneDrive as my example here. And the question there is about, some organizations might control within within Office 365 itself, whether external sharing is allowed in the way that I've kind of implied in this journey. And you're right, some organizations won't even allow that. But again, that could be a real operational risk, because how then does that user share stuff externally, or how do they collaborate with an external supplier or someone that they need to work with? So if they can't do it in OneDrive, would they try and find some other potentially even riskier way to do it, right? They'll try and use WeTransfer or ZippyShare or whatever their favorite tool is. So we have to be careful about saying no to things and blocking things, because it can force even worse behaviors.
So, or if currently file sharing is not allowed, this might give businesses comfort that they could safely start to allow file sharing, for example.
So we didn't actually comment on the poll, but the poll results, strongly showed that email was the way that people feared their content would escape the organization. I think it's still like the go-to way for a user or an employee to try and share data externally, right? So this is why we were always asked about it. So, and why we'll see in a bit why we have a solution there now. But I'm just going to drill down into data protection. Because too often when we talk about data protection, people leap to thinking about DLP and trying to spot sensitive data and stuff. So, our goal with data protection, if we had it, would be to have a big data protection dial, and we'd turn it up to 11, and it would drop our risk, of data leakage, of data loss down to, a safe level, which is kind of what I'm representing here. So I call this section of my presentation the kind of dials and slider section. And you'll see why, because I'm going to introduce a few dials, and we're going to twiddle them, and we'll see what happens. Anyway, bear with me. So basically, in order to try and think about how we can tune our policies and control users' activities, I'm going to introduce this concept of kind of having these dials that we can adjust. So if we were looking at a user's activities that they might conduct within cloud applications, there are certain activities that we could consider more risky than others. And so I've put upload as like perhaps a more risky activity that the user could take, because that's where data leaves, right? It's just shortly behind it is post. And then around the other side, there's the action of logging into an app or viewing something in an app, lower risk activities, right? So upload is inherently risky to me if data is moving outbound, it's moving towards high risk. However, if I introduce another dial, if I understand something about the application that's being used, my risk could increase even further if I knew that application was inherently risky. And Rob mentioned the ZippyShare, which is like the application I pick on all the time because it's some freeware file sharing application. But I also talked about WeTransfer perhaps being in that kind of bracket of fairly risky as an application. And over the other side of the dial, well, if we understand that an application is safer to use, it's a bit more enterprise ready, maybe we know that it encrypts our data at rest and that it offers multi-factor sign-in and things like that, that could be a safe application. So but the more we know about the application, the more we can feed that into our understanding of what risk it might pose to let our users use those applications. But there's more we can understand, right? And there's more we can control. So, okay, let's say I am going to a very high risk application. Then what I could do would maybe limit access to that application to only authorized users, or make sure that the person signing into that app was using the correct corporate credentials. And by ensuring that only an authorized user has access to this app and is performing this upload action, I can lower my risk a little bit, right? As opposed to maybe the worst case, which would be, a user that I've already identified as being particularly high risk, who maybe has had issues in the past with going to the wrong cloud apps and doing the wrong things. So now we've got our authorized user. We've established something about the identity of the user. Maybe we know they're on a trusted device, they're in a trusted location, and we certainly know who they are. But we could do something else with our policy to lower risk further, and that would be to understand the data that was being uploaded. So the data sensitivity, again, has a range from being just a publicly classified document, which we're not too worried about being shared externally, through to the most confidential of our data that we hold within our organization. So in this case, if I establish that data sensitivity is low, and it's actually a publicly classified document in this case, you can see my risk on the right-hand side there now dropping almost into acceptable levels. So once I understand all this information, all this context about what the user's doing and who they are and the application they're accessing, then I could set a policy, and maybe rather than just allowing that to happen, maybe I'd pop up a message to say, you sure you want to be uploading this here? Just have a little think before you continue. And by just putting in that extra reminder to the end user, I reduce risk even further, because it means I'm just challenging them, making them think about it. It's quite an effective way to make people evaluate their actions a little bit further. So we started off with what was a risky activity, but by understanding the full context of what's going on with all our various dials here, we've reduced risk into a sensible area. Now, if I sort of spin one of my dials, there are limits to what PowerPoint can do, so it spins around a little bit wildly there, and we say, actually, we've changed nothing else, but we've now established that this data is sensitive. It's the most sensitive data we hold. It's confidential. At this point, our risk has just hit the ceiling, and we need to adjust our policy accordingly. So let's change our policy and say, look, if it's confidential, then you can only upload it to a managed instance of a cloud app, a cloud app that belongs to us, our Office 365 environment, our Salesforce environment. And immediately by doing that, the risk comes down again. If furthermore, we adjust it to say that we want to do some step-up authentication, we want to do some MFA before you can complete that action, we can reduce our risk further again, because now we know that this is a valid and authenticated and trusted user performing the action. So see, this is how we can bring risk down without impacting that operational risk, without defaulting to block. Because there's no doubt that if I did set my policy action to block every time, my risk of data loss is low, right? This is a policy that is watertight, but it's also going to impact business operations potentially, which is the point that somebody made earlier. So we don't often.
And Ross, just to use a real example that that Russell's come up with. So imagine the department looks to email out a Word document, and within that Word document, there are 10 Excel documents embedded within it. Can Netscope still read and check, looking for that, patient level information, for example? Obviously Russell's from a healthcare organization, so can it see documents within a document or files within a document?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll scan everything we can see will be scanned. And specifically for email, I'll talk about that and attachments later. I'm very much kind of focusing on the cloud apps still here, because that is, such an important area for most organizations now. Email is well understood, but cloud applications and how they're being used and the art of managing that is still a bit of a dark art. So hence all the dials, if you're still following the dials. So what I will say is that if you've got a solution that doesn't understand data sensitivity, if you're not able to perform DLP in the classic sense, if you don't understand the risk associated with applications, if your policy just simply allow or block as choices, then you begin to be unable to escape from this high risk position. You'll always be up in the red. You just don't have the toolkit to be able to lower this any further, apart from setting things to block. And that brings risk down, but as I say, it brings risk down at the cost of introducing operational risk, and that you can't do things. So, what you're looking at here is what a traditional secure web gateway, web filter would typically give you, right? It has no understanding of applications or data. It can block or allow based on perhaps URLs and domains. Maybe it can differentiate between someone uploading and downloading, but there's a lot missing from the picture. So going to drill down into this data sensitivity dial really, and this will link us nicely onto our conversation about email, because it's all very well saying, you've got a publicly classified document, or you've got a confidential document, or you've got something that contains, PII, but how? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how Netscope can help you establish how sensitive a document, a piece of data is. So the first thing you can do is you can examine the content of that file, whether it's attached to the email or whether it's being uploaded to Dropbox, whatever. You can examine the text and you can look for text and patterns within it. So this could be looking for phrases that you know to look for. If you're marking documents with top secret, then you could just look for that phrase. And that tells you something about the context of that document and where and how it should be being used. Or you could look for a particular project name and so on. If you're using something like Azure Information Protect as part of Office 365, and you're labeling documents with sensitivity, you're classifying them, then you could look for those labels, those classifiers within the metadata of the documents, or within the headers and footers of documents and things like that. And furthermore, if you're well into your regex and start pushing the boundaries of what I generally dabble with, but if you know your regexes, then you could build those too to detect certain types of data in a certain type of format. Obviously, and I'm sure there'll be someone on the call that knows their way around the regex and would love to do that. You can combine these things together then and apply logic. So we could look for top secret and project X, or we could look for top secret near project X. There's all these kind of operators that we could apply to our text and pattern matching. And that's super simple to set up. As you can imagine, you just type words and phrases in or upload a dictionary. So we could get more sophisticated. Well, more sophisticated in what we do, but actually simpler from an administrator's perspective. You could use some of the built-in identifiers that Netscope actually offers. So there's a little sample here in this screenshot. Let's look up medical data, and we look under medical products, and we see brand drug names and drugs and compounds. So just getting a bit of feedback from somebody on the phone. I'll just ask if you're not asking a question, if you could go on mute, that would be great. So if you've got thousands of data identifiers to go through, to choose from, you can obviously build some quite sophisticated policies to identify sensitive data. And if you can apply that across thousands of file types, then you're in a good place, because you can identify stuff. But if the thought of having to figure out what sensitive data looks like within your environment and what might be important to you, if that seems too much, then you could use some templates that are pre-built. So if you want to look for PII data, or you need to look for PCI related data, then these data identifiers that we saw here on the left have been pulled together under these default templates, and we can apply them. So sometimes these are quite broad. When we deploy a GDPR policy and just sort of let it go wild, look for anything GDPR related, you can get quite a lot of information back, and you'll actually hit quite a lot of incidents. So quite often you'd end up tuning that probably to narrow the field of view. Otherwise you get overwhelmed, right? That's everybody's fear with data loss prevention. You get overwhelmed with perhaps false positives. So compliance templates make things easy to get started. Many data identifiers help you tune things. Text and pattern matching helps you zero in on what you're after. But we can also do some more sophisticated things, such as exact match, or exact data match, as it's sometimes called, where you give us some content that you need to look for. And that could be in a particular format, or it could be a particular set of data that we need to find within, regardless of format. And similarly, we could do something like fingerprinting, where you say, here's a PDF form that I need you to scan and create a hash of. And then if you see that form going anywhere, or if you see that form but it's changed, that would indicate perhaps that we'd seen perhaps a form that had been completed, and that once it's completed, maybe then it contains sensitive information. So you can do some really cool stuff with fingerprinting to spot different versions or changes within data. And then you could get very sophisticated. You do things like OCR. So if you want to extract text from images, if you're worried about someone perhaps taking a photo of some sensitive information and then trying to attach that to an email and send it out, for example, we could extract that text and again find these the text or the pattern or the regex or the data identifiers, find it, but through extraction of the data from an image. Quite sophisticated. And my most sophisticated capability, although again one of the simplest to actually implement, is Netscope's machine learning enhanced classification. So here's an AI application for data loss prevention, where we've actually trained some DLP engines to look for certain types of sensitive imagery, but also text-based content as well. So Netscope can actually recognize screenshots. We can recognize images of whiteboards. We can recognize certain sensitive identity documents like driver's licenses and passports. And you see an image of a credit card there. So this isn't using text extraction. We're not looking at this and saying, oh, there's a credit card number on that credit card. We're saying this looks like a credit card. It's quite a sophisticated method and actually very accurate in terms of picking up sensitive information. We do similar things with content like source code or resumes or CVs, as we call them, and in that we've trained our systems to know what those types of images look like. And if we see it, we can say, oh, well, this looks like source code. Are you sure you want to be sending this to somebody via email or uploading it to Zippy Share? So this is an overview.
We've got from an Every Cloud perspective, we've got a couple of as you know, Premier League football clubs who use the Netscope solution, and things like youth data, training stats, Opta stats, medical data is all the kind of stuff, obviously, for them to protect. So it's just an interesting angle that we found in the sports arena as well.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. One organization's sensitive data, another organization doesn't care about. It's not always possible to say that here's a regulatory template, because that regulation might not apply there. So there's always a degree of tuning. But yeah, it's interesting to know. It's interesting to find what sensitive data organizations actually hold, because sometimes they don't even realize that perhaps what they have is so sensitive, and they have an obligation to protect it, and that it would be bad press, if nothing else, if it got out. So hold all these capabilities in your mind in terms of the way that we can actually detect and identify the sensitive data, because we're going to move on and we're going to talk about what we do specifically around email. So remember, Haley, hopefully now you can see how using the dials to set the policies and set the policy outcome, consider all the inputs, how we could redirect Haley down this route. And and at this final stage where we said to Haley, it looks like you got some PII in there, we could have probably recognized that through either a PII or GDPR profile applied, or maybe we're using an identifier to look for people's names or birthdays or things like that. So that's what was being applied at the end here. But let's look at this email piece then. So I said at the start that there was this route out of the organization that many of you in the poll suggested was the one that you worried about most, and that was email leaving the organization. So we saw these pictures earlier. This is Netscope turning the email, or rather Office 365 turning its email into Netscope Security Cloud, and then Netscope Security Cloud applying those DLP engines and capabilities to identify sensitive data, and then tagging the email. And when I say tagging, if you know about SMTP email, we're talking about adding a header. So Netscope Security Cloud is not a full NTA. We're not trying to replace anyone's mails transfer. I can't remember what MTA stands for. Help me out, techies. But no, mail transfer agent, is that right? I think it is. Anyway, regardless, we're not trying to replace whatever you use to send your email to the outside world. And in actual fact, this is why we are only adding these headers. We actually need something further down the line to action on those headers. So I'm going to redraw this diagram just to give you a better picture of what's happening. But what's important here, in the case of this email, we've identified some PCI related data in it, some credit cards or whatever. And at this point, that when it leaves Netscope Security Cloud, it still has that data. It's just been tagged as having that data now. So what that means is, let's redraw the picture. My email gets sent, and it's not just Office 365 we currently support. We also support Gmail or the Google Workspace environment. So emails from this sending environment would come to Netscope Security Cloud, and we are like an SMTP proxy. We do our DLP policies, and we put a header into a header or headers that you can customize. So you could say this is sensitive, or you could say this is PCI data, or you could have a marker that said stop this. We don't actually mind what that header says, because the header, the action is taken on that email by the MTA that we then send to. So if you're a Mimecast customer, if you're a Proofpoint customer, or you have some other MTA out here that can read email headers, then you're ready to integrate with Netscope, because we're going to write that header and then something's going to happen here. And it might be that email goes no further, It might be that the attachment is stripped from the email. It could be that it's, a disclaimer is added to the email, that it's forwarded to somebody else. All the things you can do with these types of email security solutions, right? Now, if you don't have, one of these email security solutions, there is a way that you can actually loop back through Office 365 or Gmail to send the email out. So in my demo environments, I don't have any of these vendors set up. So I just loop my email back through Office 365 and I say, look, if you see an email with this header added, then it goes no further, or it gets a disclaimer added to it, or again, whatever my policy action needs to be. So
I think, Ross, just before you'd done that piece on Mimecast, Sam Richardson was asking exactly that question. So Sam, are you happy your question's been answered in terms of absolutely this works with Mimecast?
Yep,
if you're reading through Mimecast, absolutely it works.
Yep,
yeah,
great.
And I guess we've kind of launched this solution with some partners in mind. Mimecast is one of them. As I say, some organizations don't have that. Now, I'm just going to stress again, we're talking about outbound email here. Netscope is not interested in any inbound flow into your organization. So, for example, if you are a Mimecast customer, Mimecast will be doing all your email protection, right? It'll be doing the anti-phishing and all the other cool stuff it does with its threat intelligence. So, we're not interested in anything inbound. This is all about outbound, and it's all about DLP and preventing data escaping when it shouldn't. So we've actually got our third poll here, which is just a bit of a nosy question. I'm interested in knowing, what email platform you're actually using, because I've said here that we support, Gmail, Office 365, or Exchange Online. But I'm curious who's still using something that's on premises, perhaps. And it might be that if you are, you might be thinking about moving things out into Exchange Online. That's quite a common conversation that we seem to be having with people. So yeah, I'm interested in the feedback there, I guess, and we'll have a chat at the results when they come up. It's worth saying at the moment that I've kind of perhaps suggested this email capability, that email DLP is quite new to Netscope. It is launched this year, so it is kind of new. We're in a position of kind of just announcing it publicly at the moment and onboarding our first few customers and getting them using the solution. As I said earlier, typically many of those new email DLP customers are existing Netscope customers who have been waiting and chomping at the bit for this functionality. So also everybody on the call, or everybody that completed the poll, is using Office 365. Well, yeah, I'm slightly surprised, but perhaps that's just the way things are going, right? Maybe you're all super cloud first out there, and that's why you're so interested in hearing what I've got to say. But I'm sure we can all think of other organizations perhaps that haven't quite moved that quickly, and it'll be interesting to see when they do. One of the reasons I ask that question is because I say we have talked to people that are on premises, and they're kind of saying, well, surely we could make this work with on premises. And I think the answer is we probably could. It's where we draw a line in terms of supporting it. And as I say, even those that are on premises, they seem to have a goal or a desire to move into the cloud. That seems to be the way everybody's going with their email platforms. Okay, cool. So there's a couple of other chat questions.
Yeah, a couple of things. Stephen did point out that there is always the hybrid 365 on-prem option, which I know a couple of customers do have. That was just an observation, really. A question from Mark: can Netscope actually inspect encrypted, password-protected attachments as well?
So we can't. No, I know there are solutions out there that will kind of try and either guess at the password or extract the password from the email body and apply it to attachments. Very sophisticated stuff. And I think that's great from an inbound perspective if you've got tools that can do that. From Netscope's perspective, no, we can identify when a file is an archive file, and specifically whether it's a password protected archive file. So you could have a policy that said, if I see a password protected attachment, I could mark it as such. And then again, that upstream MTA could say, well, okay, we'll just put this into a hold until someone checks out what this is. But no, by its nature, if it's an encrypted container, then we're not going to be able to see what's inside it. But as I say, we can identify the fact that it is encrypted.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. Cool. Right. Well, you'll be relieved to know I'm heading towards my last slide now. So hopefully you've got some value out of the slides so far. But here's my summary slide. I've gone all serious and sinister in the black again. So my slide template's not messing with your head too much. But data protection, then I've kind of said a few things and I want to summarize them. So data protection is more than DLP, by which I mean we're often very quick to think about data protection as being, identifying sensitive data and blocking it things. But actually, hopefully with the dials that I showed and the example of Haley in marketing, we can do a lot to protect our data before we actually have to look at the data. We can look at where it's going and how it's being used and who's using it and so on. And that's all data protection, right? Before we even get to the point of inspecting what that content is, we can have a lot of control over where it's going and how it's being used. I would say this, of course, but only Netscope has all the dials. I made a point of saying what your traditional secure gateway could typically do, maybe when it was looking at content that was going out to the internet. And if you want that level of control, then, Netscope, well, we can give that to you. And finally, there's this kind of 4-in-1 data protection message that I wanted to leave you. And you might have picked it up as we've gone along, but if you're sending documents, data, kind of the same thing really, outward, then send it through Netscope Security Cloud and we'll see it. We'll see it en route to websites and we can stop that. We can see it en route to SaaS applications and we can control and manage that as we've seen. If someone's uploading it to an AWS S3 bucket or an Azure blob storage, we can see that too. And finally, of course, if they are sending that data out via email and it's coming out via SMTP from your mail servers, then we can see that too now. We can define one DLP policy that can see any of these egress methods from the organization. I think that's the real sort of power of what Netscope can do, and it's analogous to perhaps what used to be called the enterprise DLP solution, which used to be a standalone kind of market segment defined by Gartner. But enterprise DLP as a solution has kind of disappeared as DLP has become a function of other things, and in Netscope's case, it's a function of our platform, of the SASE architecture, basically. So if you're interested in consolidating DLP that you already have, or you're interested in doing something new with DLP, have a chat with us. Get in touch with EveryCloud, get in touch with us, and we'll talk to you.